Yeah, so today I'm just going to go through kind of the journey that I took when I was trying to integrate AMP into Gousto, and how that led me into kind of the world of Vue and Nuxt. So just quickly about myself, I'm a software engineer here at Gousto. I'm a front-end engineer. I mainly work with JavaScript and React. I work within the radishes team here. Our primary concern is acquisition, so we are concerned with acquiring new customers. So as part of that falls under the umbrella of customers who visit our website via referral, so they might have been referred by a friend, or somebody who's visited our site via organic search, so somebody who's hit a search engine, typed in a recipe box, and they found us. And the scenario here is during Tech 10%, which is an initiative that we have here at Gousto. Every second Friday, we're given the time to work on a project of our own choosing. I decided to take a look at our cookbook, which is a set of pages that customers find when they search for a specific recipe in a search engine. These pages are specifically targeted towards those customers. So I decided to take a look at how we could boost the performance of these pages, not only the technical performance, the page speed of the pages, but also where they rank within a search engine. Cool, so just what I'll go through today is AMP, what it is, how to use it, and what the specification of that technology is. I'll go through some rendering frameworks that we can use to generate these AMP pages. Following that, I'll go through Nuxt and universal apps, and then just some takeaways, things that I've learned, things that I think are useful from this whole experience. So AMP, before I start, has anybody used AMP before? Cool, so a few of us in the room. I'll just go through it just so that everybody's kind of got a basis from which to understand this. Essentially, AMP stands for Accelerated Mobile Pages. It's a technology from Google. It's both a specification, so a way for pages to be validated against, as well as an open source library of components. Those components have a similar API to web components in their usage. The goal of AMP is primarily mobile speed. Google's trying to promote quick mobile pages. And the benefit of actually implementing this technology instead of just making quicker mobile pages is there are some preferential treatment, if it were, by Google. So they'll give your users an indication that this page is actually written in AMP. And they'll actually preload some of your AMP search results. So if a user makes a search, an AMP result appears in that search, Google will actually prefetch it so that when somebody clicks on that search result, it'll load instantaneously. So there's kind of a twofold benefit. It's a quick page, but it's also preloaded when you use Google as your search engine. So. And the way it looks, so if we were to just make a general Google search, you get the generic search results. Search results are defined as the list of items that appear when you make a search. If we were to search for a dimension that AMP supports, those pages will, what will happen is a carousel will appear. So this is context specific, so it has to be a dimension that's supported by Nuxt, by AMP. And it will load in this context-specific area at the top here. So for news, this is the top stories section. And generally within this section, AMP results are actually preferred. So if you can see that top result there, it's got the AMP logo, and it's obviously the top result. So that lets users know that it's an AMP page. And it's likely that once I've made this search, that page is already preloaded. So when I click on that link, it loads straight away. Similarly, if I was to search for another dimension, such as recipes, this context-specific carousel appears. And most of the items within this carousel not only contain recipe structured data, but they actually contain, it's an AMP page itself. So if I was to click through that as well, you see even more of the structured data from that page, as well as the AMP logo, just letting the users know, kind of reinforcing that fact that this is a quick mobile page. Some of the other dimensions that AMP supports, for those of you in the room who work with these fields, it might be useful just to look into AMP. So it supports articles, videos, recipes. So for us, this was something that was enticing. Restaurants, blog posts, and they're also trying out stories, which are similar to Snapchat or Instagram stories. That's currently experimental. And the requirements of an AMP page. So for us as developers, if we were to write a page, these are the things that we need to do in order to have it valid as an AMP page, as well as preloaded. So the page must use AMP HTML. That's this HTML here. So if you can't see it. But essentially, there's some fundamental changes to a HTML document that's using AMP. You require that lightning bolt on the HTML tag, as well as you have to load in the AMP script. There's no authored JS, which essentially means that you can't put a script tag and put your own code in there. You have to, if you want dynamic aspects of the page, you have to do it the AMP way, which I'll go through a bit later. And also there's no external style sheets, so all of the styles within the document have to be within the document. That's either in the head of the document or in line with the components themselves. And the reason that Google's done this is primarily to stop external requests. It means that the pages are quick. So even if you're not using AMP, I think the way that Google's architected AMP kind of lends itself to being quick, and these are things that we can do in our regular web pages, even if we weren't using AMP, to make them quicker. Some of the examples that are contained within the actual library. You've got basic elements, so you've got the image, accordion, carousel elements that you can use within AMP, as well as some others that are not quite elements, but they are almost APIs within the AMP library, such as AMP bind, analytics. You can also bring in YouTube videos, Snapchat videos, SoundCloud. It has a ton of support. So the fact that you can't author your own JS isn't really a limitation, because a lot of the things for these mobile pages are already thought about, and they're already included within the library itself. So just taking a look at some of those components, the image and bind components. The way that the AMP image works is you bring it in as this amp-image tag. You specify a width and a height that's required. The page needs to know how large your image is. And the main thing for that width and height is this layout responsive right here, which essentially tells this component to use the size that its parent has given it, whilst maintaining the aspect ratio that the width and height denote. And there's other benefits to using AMP image. Lazy loading is intrinsically baked into AMP image, so the images aren't going to load unless the user's actually scrolling that image into their viewport, which is really handy. As well as loading indicators. Say somebody lands on a page and an image is already there, it's going to provide you a loading indicator while that network request is going on. And all of those things are baked into the library. You don't have to add anything for those. Similarly, AMP bind is the way that we do dynamic interactions within AMP. So when the page loads, you embed the data that you want dynamic on the page. So for example, if I had an e-commerce site, I would embed the data of the product and all of its variants within the page, and then I would provide some buttons to allow people to maybe change the quantity, and then the price would update on the fly using AMP bind. You can bind variables and do a bit of custom JavaScript within that. So working with AMP, now that we've decided that we want to use this to try and improve our SEO, we've seen the benefit of actually putting that technology as part of our pages. How do we create an application around AMP? So the first port of call for me was React. I'm a React engineer. I thought, why not? We've already got a universal app here at Gousto. React's got components. It's got a great ecosystem around rendering frameworks. It's got Gatsby and Next. The issue that I found for React, this has since been patched and they fixed it, but at the time it was reconciliation. So React would complain if it didn't know what a specific component was. And since AMP is using custom components without bringing in an external library, that presented itself an issue. So I decided to look at other means of rendering AMP pages. So the next step for me was, okay, if I can't do it in React and I can't bring it into our application, I'm going to have to create my own. So I'll take a look at the simplest way of doing that, which is Handlebars. Handlebars is a templating framework. It's similar to Mustache or Liquid if you've used those. And yeah, that worked. It was quite happy accepting those AMP components. It's template based, so it's not going to complain. There's no reconciliation or diffing involved. It just takes what it's given. And it's got snippet support, so if I wanted to try and emulate components, I could do within Handlebars, but they aren't components. And that was the main drawback for me. If I was going to create an application, I wanted it to be a modern application that I could test. Snippets aren't, the way of testing snippets for me felt a bit end-to-endy rather than actually testing the logic contained within those snippets. So, and as well, there's a bunch of server-side boilerplate. So around Handlebars, there's not really a go-to framework. It's quite loose in the fact that it's template-based. So there was a lot of server-side boilerplate for me to write. It's got integrations with Express. But I found that even with that, generating a server-side rendering framework around Handlebars, there was a lot of boilerplate to write. So I didn't go down that route, which took me kind of back to looking at Vue. Vue is similar to React in the fact that it's got components, but the way that it treats those components and the output of those components is template-like. It's not going to complain about the actual component itself. All it's going to do is diff that against an update. It's also got a great ecosystem for creating apps. So Nuxt was one of those that I found. So now that we've kind of decided that Vue is the way to go, I'll just go into how that led me through to choosing Nuxt. So universal applications, Matt's already gone through it, but we also know them as isomorphic applications. Essentially what it means is you're getting a server rendered page, the client side is going to hydrate that page with the library, and there's some form of code reuse between the two. And that was what I was going for with this application. And the kind of layout at the minute of universal applications in the world is you've got this level here. When you first come to use Vue and React, you'll tend to go to create React app or Vue CLI as your kind of go-to starting points, and that's what they're for. They're for users to start writing these frameworks as quickly as possible. There isn't that much of a focus on the actual build outputs of these tools. Whereas universal application frameworks like Nuxt.js, Gatsby, and Nuxt have a focus on not only getting the user writing as quickly as possible, but also this is an application, it's going to be put somewhere, and it shows. So if we go into Nuxt, so Nuxt is a framework for creating Vue applications. It is opinionated. They do sort of stress some things on you, but these are based on Vue best practices. I think Nuxt is a great way to get into Vue. You can do both at the same time. You'll learn a lot from the decisions that Nuxt has made. It's great for speedy development. If you know the Nuxt way, then it's very quick to start up a new project and get yourself coding as quickly as possible, as well as making the changes that you need to make for whatever your use case is. They've got great documentation. It's really great for universal applications. The default export for Nuxt is universal apps. You don't have to change anything. And it's flexible and extensible. So yes, there are some decisions made about how we architect our application, but if we need to make any changes to that application, it's usually already thought about. The problem with Create React App and Vue CLI is sometimes you can you need something more from the framework, especially in terms of output. And those frameworks tend to either have a specific way, and if you cannot do it within those tools, then you need to eject and start writing some custom JS. Nuxt, for the most part, what I found is that there's usually an answer for all of it, and the team are more than happy to implement if not. So the way that a Nuxt application is laid out is probably one of the most opinionated things about the framework. But once you learn it, it'll kind of become second knowledge to you. I just want to point out, like, they're using Vue best practices within this layout. So the components are all Vue single file components. And similarly, the state, they're using modular portions of state. Also, with the way that the routing works within Nuxt is it's all automatic. So in this pages directory, all we have to do is enter an index. So that's where the user is going to land. And then if somebody was to hit a custom route, we can automatically take the variable from that route, and that will be available to us within the page. Similarly, if we were to create a folder, that's creating a route within our application. And the way that Nuxt renders our application is it goes from the document level, which is that they've got a default document, but if you wanted to override that with an app.html file, you can do. A layout folder, and that will render a layout. And if you wanted to change your layout, Nuxt will automatically take the name of the layout file and make that the switch for you if you wanted to override that in your pages. Then they will render whatever page route that you've hit, and any components or children of that page contained therein. So just taking a deeper look into some of those folders and the structures of the files that we put in them. So the component folder is, it uses Vue single file components to write your components. Essentially, it will take this, this is defined as actually a Vue spec, it's not a Nuxt thing. You've got this template tag at the top where your markup goes, a script tag, which is the export of the component itself, as well as the styles in that component. And the styles are optional. It supports scoping. Pre-processing is also optional. So if you wanted to use Sass in Nuxt, all you have to do is add the Sass attribute to your style tag, and it will automatically compile that back down for you. And similarly, the scoping, if you just wanted these styles to be scoped to this component, you can do that as well. And if having all of your styles, your markup, and your JS in the same file sounds a bit weird, I'd encourage you to use it, because this is kind of the Vue way, but if you wanted to import those, you can do. Nuxt gives you that option. So you can co-locate your styles in your JS. And similarly, the store directory has a few opinions of its own. So Nuxt uses Vuex for state management. If you wanted to use something else, you're more than welcome to. But if you create a store directory in the root of your Nuxt app, it will automatically include Vuex for you. It's a zero config directory, which means that essentially if we were to create a file within that directory, Nuxt is also automatically going to make that portion of your store globally accessible. So for instance, if we were to create this welcome.js, this is a fairly simple piece of state. It contains a greeting, which is a string, as well as a single mutation, which takes in a name and then updates that string. And then we can use that in our templates in the pages directory simply by creating a Vue single file component. That component uses computed properties. The computed property greeting actually takes out that string that we're defining in our state file, and it also allows us to mutate that state by using an input that has a Vue event key appender, which will call the actual mutation and update the value of that input. So essentially, when you see this page, you'll just type in your name, and then it will update everything based on the state, because everything's linked up automatically. And if you wanted just one single file for your state, you can do that as well. Nuxt gives you that option, but this is kind of the way that they're trying to push it, keeping all your pieces of state modular to the function that you're actually trying to do within your application. So those are some of the decisions that Nuxt made about architecture. But the actual build targets that Nuxt allows us to export to, so we've created an application, we're looking to actually serve that application. There's 3 different ways that Nuxt allows us to do it. The first of which is an SPA. So we can generate an SPA from our application. So this is no server-side rendering. Vue will instantiate the components when the page is loaded. And all we have to do to generate an application that does that is just type Nuxt build with the SPA flag. And that will tell Nuxt to generate an SPA for us. The second way is static mode. So this will pre-generate the files for us in the dist directory. Nuxt will essentially walk through the paths laid out in your application and generate files based on them. There's a bit more to it, but essentially, we simply tell Nuxt to generate the files. It will go to the first route and then walk through the remaining routes to generate all of the files for your application, so that you can go and host those in a CDN or on a server somewhere. That also will include a client-side bundle that will hydrate to allow dynamic consecutive clicks. And universal mode, this is a default mode of Nuxt. Essentially, it's just as we described, it's server rendered, and then it will hydrate the Vue instance. For this, you don't need to do anything. Just the general commands, Nuxt build and Nuxt start, will generate a universal app for you. Okay, so that's Nuxt, and we went through AMP before. So how do we get these 2 technologies to work together? The first step that we need to make is we just need to change the HTML template of that page to conform to the AMP standard. So in Nuxt, this means that we just create an app.html file, and this will contain that lightning bolt as well as some attributes that will allow Nuxt to superimpose all of the other things that it needs to do and the rest of your app, of course, within those app tags. And that's it. That's all we need to do. The app template is available from the Nuxt library. Similarly, we need to bring in the AMP library into the document. So Nuxt has got 2 ways of doing this. We could either just load it in our page using the layout, or we could use the API for injecting things into the head of the document. So what this means is essentially we're trying to get this library to load for every page. So if we use the Nuxt config, it's going to load for everything. So we export this head object that contains a script array of items, and one of the objects in that is our AMP script. And that will load it for every single page. Third thing that we need to do is use our AMP components. Here I'm using a custom component. This is coming from the AMP extended library. It's a SoundCloud component, and it's also using Vue directive to load in a custom track ID. So this is a good example of a way of creating a component I can reuse across my site, but is still taking dynamic data from Vue. And it's also using the head API to load in that extended library of AMP components, which means that that piece of the head, that script will only load if this component is actually rendered on a page. So that's one of the powers of Nuxt, is that it allows you to override and add to the head with using those APIs very easily. The last thing that we need to do to create an AMP Nuxt application is to denote a build target. So because AMP requires no authored JS, that essentially rules out client-side JavaScript. So our possible targets are pre-rendered using the Nuxt generate command and server-side rendering using Nuxt universal. All we need to do in that case is disable hydration. Nuxt got a great example of how to actually get AMP up and running. They've got a great examples of a bunch of different ways and different applications. So I'd encourage you to go check out their GitHub examples folder. They've got about 30 odd examples in there, and they're kept up to date. So they're really great ways of going about creating an application if you don't know what to do. So cool, and that's it. That's literally all we have to do to get an AMP application running, up and running in Nuxt. The key takeaways I want to take from my learning experience during this journey is the first one is the power of the convention over configuration approach. Because Nuxt does have its own opinions, it means that you're learning best practices from the start. It also means that if I was to create a different application using the same framework, I know where to go, I know how to architect my application straight away, which kind of lends itself to speed. It means I'm not writing a bunch of boilerplate, and that's kind of paid off in a later slide. I'll go through. The second thing that I wanted to kind of for you to take away is that if you focus on what you want to do instead of the technology, is like my first port of call for this was to use React. But I quickly found that wasn't the right way to go. And if I focused on what I actually wanted to output, which was AMP, and I just wanted to create an application around that, that led me kind of down this path to Nuxt and Vue. And it's paid off in the fact that later on in the year, I was able to attend a hackathon at Google. Essentially, I was the only engineer there, but we had a UI and UX designer there. I was able to get an application up and running very quickly because I'd already learned Nuxt and learned the power of Nuxt, the different ways that I could output applications. So it allowed me to get up and running and work with them early on in the day, which meant that ultimately our prototype ended up winning that hackathon because we were able to get ourselves up and running, bootstrap ourselves, and then create an application that was extremely useful. And I'll be posting some more findings on this AMP journey in our blog. That's at Gousto Engineering Tech Brunch on Medium. That's it from me.